Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the 7th week of our series, King Jesus. The series in which we are journeying together through the book of the Bible called the Gospel of Mark. And this week, our Master's College and Seminary intern, Caden Janes, led us through a conversation that takes place in Mark chapter 10. And within that conversation, as Caden shared, Jesus uses an oxymoron that not only defines how we're meant to live within God's kingdom, but an oxymoron that redefines what greatness is. So let's take a look. In Mark chapter 10, verse 32, we read that Jesus and his disciples and crowds of people were making their way toward Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way. And we're told that the disciples were astonished and the people who were following them were afraid. Now, why were they astonished? Why were they afraid? If you keep reading, you see that Jesus once again outlines for his followers what's going to happen when they reach Jerusalem. He tells them that he is going to be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him and kill him and flog him and all the other things that they could possibly do, and that 3 days later he'll rise again. And so the disciples are stunned because he speaks about all these horrible things awaiting him in Jerusalem, and yet he's still walking towards it. In fact, he's leading the way. And so how did the disciples react? Well, we see that James and John, they pull Jesus aside, and you think it would be to offer to pray for him or pass along their sympathies, but instead they simply ask Jesus to do them a favor, which feels like a weird time to do so, right? Like, read the room. Instead of snapping at them, though, for their insensitivities, Jesus graciously responds with a question. He says, well, what do you want me to do for you? And so their response is, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. I mean, they swing for the fences. What they're asking is to be in places of honor, to be in places of authority and power in God's kingdom. And as Caden pointed out, this conversation is revealing that at that point, James and John, they had a really different agenda for following Jesus. They were looking for prominence and position. James and John had embraced an entirely wrong vision of God and his purposes. And so they were bent on defeating an evil Roman Empire with an evil and violent Jewish revolution. And before we maybe start judging James and John, we actually have to stop and ask ourselves, how often do we confuse Jesus' agenda with our own agenda? How often do we look to gain position or power or control for ourselves? I mean, think about how many Christians try to build God's kingdom here on earth, and many of us think it has to be, it's done through this great kind of Christians in high places in the government so that we can kind of control the law of the land. Yet stories like this one show that Jesus' kingdom is a kingdom marked by love and humility. And what's true is that we don't expand the kingdom of God by changing the law. We expand the kingdom of God by reaching people's hearts. Too often we try to build God's kingdom by the same means the world builds its kingdoms. And so Jesus is going to challenge that perception. And in verse 38, Jesus says to James and John, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? Which is a confusing response, and so allow me to break it down for you a little bit. In the Hebrew scriptures, the cup is always used to describe the just judgment of God against evil and sin. And the word baptism here is used to denote an overwhelming experience, an immersing experience. And so what Jesus is pointing to is the overflowing suffering he's about to endure to take the just judgment of God on himself. And what he's saying is that this is his greatest moment of glory. It isn't a military conquest of Rome. Instead, it's on a cross where he's rejected, tortured, and crucified. And the irony of the request from James and John is that in the moment of glory, when Jesus is on the cross, there is going to be somebody on his right and on his left in the positions that James and John covet, but it's going to be two criminals who are crucified beside Jesus. Now, James and John are still not getting it because they still can't wrap their minds around what it means to be great in God's kingdom. They still want the violent revolution. And so they tell Jesus, of course we can drink the cup and be baptized with you. And when the other disciples, they hear the conversation taking place, they become indignant. They get mad because they don't think it's fair that James and John would become the greatest in God's kingdom. And so hearing the squabbling breaking out, Jesus calls all the disciples over, and this is what he says. He says, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. He simply starts off by telling them how the world currently works, things they already know. He points out, everything the disciples have already experienced. He's saying, you've seen how leaders lead for their own benefit, how they use and how they step on people to build their own kingdom. He says, you've seen the corruption, the abuse, the selfishness. He reminds them about how the world defines success. But then he flips the script with 4 simple words. He says, not so with you. He's communicating that he is not that kind of king and that this will not be that kind of kingdom that they were expecting. He's saying that life, leadership, and greatness are going to look differently for them. Which leads us to the greatest oxymoron ever used. And as Cade pointed out, an oxymoron that absolutely has the potential to change how you live. An oxymoron that shifts your perspective on what it means to win and be great. It's the oxymoron of servant leadership. Jesus says this, he says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave to all. Jesus wants his followers to know that in God's kingdom, greatness is marked by sacrifice. That the measure of one's influence wouldn't be defined by prominence or position, but rather that one's greatness would be measured by their willingness to lay down their lives for others, to lose their agenda, to give up their rights, and ultimately be a slave to all. Jesus still calls the citizens of his kingdom to embrace a new definition of success. And Jesus could have taken the approach that James and John were expecting, and he could have started a Jewish revolution maybe against the Roman government, and perhaps it would have worked out. Perhaps he could have rallied enough people to overthrow Caesar and establish God's kingdom. But how would that kingdom be any different than all the other kingdoms of this world? I mean, could it preach that you should love your enemies when it failed to do so itself? Could it teach you how to pray for those who persecute you when instead it simply slaughtered its oppressors? Probably not, right? It would have simply been another self-seeking kingdom that gained authority by the same evil ways it was trying to overthrow. And so God's kingdom had to look different. And so Jesus, he says to his boys, he says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. He defined, embraced, and lived out a totally new approach to greatness. A kingdom whose inhabitants are known for their sacrificial love and for living out the oxymoron of servant leadership. Well, friends, consider yourselves caught up. I'll see you next time.